This woman lived at the top of a 180-foot tall tree for 2 years before being convinced to come down. Her name is Julia Hill, and it all started when a drunk driver crashed into the back of her car at high speed while she was driving an intoxicated friend home late at night. There was a loud crash, and the next moment, Julia was pushed forward with such force that the car's steering wheel penetrated inside her skull. Her friend escaped the crash with minor injuries, but Julia's critical injuries sent her to the emergency ward of a local hospital in Arkansas. After the accident, she said, "The crash woke me up to the importance of the moment and doing whatever I could to make a positive impact on the future. The steering wheel in my head, both figuratively and literally, steered me in a new direction in my life." The recovery period was excruciating as she felt helpless, not knowing if she was even going to make it. It took Julia almost a year of intensive therapy just to regain her ability to walk and speak properly. As I recovered, I realized that my whole life had been out of balance. I had graduated high school at 16 and had been working non-stop since then. I had been obsessed with my career, success, and material things. But by the end of her recovery, Julia felt like she had been given a second chance at life. So, in November of 1997, she left her home in Arkansas and took a road trip to Northern California in search of a worthy purpose. But Julia had no way of knowing that what she would soon choose to do with this second chance would have a ripple effect of massive proportions. When she first arrived in California, Julia found something in the local ancient redwood forests that had seemingly been lost to her long ago. As Julia walked past the giant trees, she felt as if she were entering a cathedral of something far more majestic than human comprehension, a sense of peaceful belonging that she had never felt before. That peace, however, was then tainted with sorrow as she began to notice more and more trees disappearing, each one taken just days after being marked with a giant orange X. Hundreds of years of history gone, just like that. She knew she needed to do something to save the ancient forest, so she came up with a plan with the help of one of the leading environmental groups, Earth First. They were among the many frontliners in a war between activists and a logging operation known as the Pacific Lumber Company, or PALCO for short. Yes, Bean, I know on the surface it may seem a bit dramatic to refer to this as a war, but in reality, what unfolded between the two sides was nothing short of a bloody conflict. There was emotional trauma, criminal cover-ups, and actual casualties, all in the name of saving one of the planet's most notable ecosystems. And Julia's plan was to aid the resistance by committing a dangerous act of civil disobedience. Good question, Bean. Civil disobedience is when the public refuses to accept and abide by certain laws for a cause. It is fairly similar to peaceful protesting, with the civil in civil disobedience reflecting its nonviolent nature.
What was that? Oh, bro, are you okay?
Yes, Grill, I'm fine. Thank you. My chair seems to have broken.
Well, it's about time you threw that old thing out anyways.
I'd rather not. Do you know how many trees are cut down every day to make things like this perfectly good chair?
Uh-huh. Looks like trash to me.
Regardless, where was I? Yes. Julia's act of civil disobedience would be to participate in a tree sit.
What's a tree sit?
According to my calculations, it means sitting in a tree.
Wow. Thank you. I never would have guessed. I was asking him to tell me more. You know, like how and why.
They would build small wooden platforms at a height of around 100 feet using ropes, much like a treehouse, but far less complex. The volunteers then would take turns sitting in there for a few days at a time, hoping the lumberjacks wouldn't chop the trees down with someone still on top of it. Although others participated in this act as well, what Julia did left one of the most significant impacts on the entire resistance. On the cold morning of December 10th, 1997, Earth First activists began preparing Julia and her designated tree for the ascent. By the time Julia's wooden nest was set up at the top of the 180-foot tall, 1,000-year-old lightning-struck redwood, the moon was rising in the night sky. Seeing lunar light shine upon the redwood tree, the activists decided to affectionately name it Luna. Her new home was 2 wooden platforms 6 feet by 4 feet each covered with tarps to give some amount of shelter. It provided a space only large enough for her to lie down and store the little amenities she had for survival. Julia had rations to keep her sustained for only a week, and other equipment such as a propane burner to cook her meals, ropes to make climbing up and down possible, and finally, the most important of them all, solar-powered cell phones.
You know what other thing she should have had to help fight that big corporation? A great legal team. Like my buds over at Morgan & Morgan. Seriously, they're incredible.
What are you talking about?
You know, America's largest personal injury law firm. These guys win big. If you ever seriously hurt, your injury could be worth millions. A Morgan & Morgan case in Florida ended in a settlement of $12 million, which is 34 times the highest insurance offer. And in Philadelphia, another case went home with 40 times the highest insurance offer at $26 million. And that was only within the last couple of months for victims involved in life-altering car crashes.
Okay, wow, that is a lot.
Right? And they don't settle for lowball offers. Instead, if you become their client, they will fight to get you what you deserve. And you don't even have to pay these guys unless you win. If God forbid you ever seriously get injured, your case could be worth millions. And you're only a few clicks away from potentially changing your life. It's so easy. You can start your claim now with Morgan & Morgan at forthepeople.com/brew, found in the description below, or by scanning the QR code on screen from your phone's camera. Thank you, Morgan & Morgan, for sponsoring today's video.
Well, Julia didn't have a legal team, but she was prepared regardless. Initially, the plan was to have Julia live in the tree for only 2 weeks, and then another volunteer would take her place, a similar strategy to what they had been practicing previously. Just a day before she climbed up Luna, Julia was excitedly telling all members, "See you all in 2 weeks." Little did she know, she would be stuck up there for far longer than originally planned.
Okay, but even if the tree sitters were up there, that would just save a few trees, right? The lumberjacks could just cut the trees around them.
That's where those solar-powered cell phones come into play. When Julia went up to live 180 feet above the ground, she tried her best to catch the attention of several radio and news channels. She contacted them and eventually succeeded in securing interviews and hosted her own cable television shows through those solar-powered cell phones. This eventually allowed her to spread awareness on a wide scale regarding the hostile and uncontrolled clear-cutting of old-growth forests. Since a considerable audience from all over Northern California now had their eyes peeled on the situation happening in the redwood forest, specifically on the lives of the tree sitters, lumberjacks avoided felling trees too close to them to avoid bad press. It wouldn't be wrong to say that Julia's efforts to bring light to the situation through media exposure worked as a protective shield against the men standing below with chainsaws at the ready. However, things took a turn for the worse after a few days. The media channels soon stopped broadcasting the tree sit, and the news slowly began to die out. After all, they weren't going to show the same thing to their audience day after day. But then, just when hope began to fade, Julia came up with a radical idea, something no one had ever done before. Apparently, life-threatening situations and record-breaking attempts grab audiences' attention very quickly, so she decided to attempt to break the record for the longest tree sit ever. The world record at the time was about 45 days, so Julia decided that she would live in the tree for 2 months straight. This quickly caught the media's focus again, and kept lumberjacks away for the time being, but this false safety was short-lived. Seeing Julia extend her stay in Luna, the logging company was stirred into action. They decided to take it upon themselves to make Julia's stay as traumatizing as possible. When it comes to Pacific Lumber Company, or PALCO, it wasn't just any local timber operation. It was one of California's major logging companies and largest private employer organization, with over 1,600 employees and a history that went all the way back to 1863. One can get an idea of how huge this company was from the fact that they owned 200,000 acres of redwood and Douglas fir forests in Humboldt County, which also earned it the title of the Redwood Empire.
Okay, but if they've been doing this for so long, why did people only start protesting now?
That's because up until the 1980s, they had been a relatively sustainable company, practicing selective logging and balancing environmental concerns with logging operations. But all that changed in the year of 1986. Maxim Group Incorporated, led by the Houston investor Charles E. Hurwitz, took over Pacific Lumber Company by purchasing 60% of its shares for $13.1 million. Although the family of the former Pacific Lumber chairman demanded that the federal district court block this merger, nothing was done to prevent the acquisition. In the end, this hostile takeover by Maxim Group Incorporated would not only prove fatal for the company, but also sparked a decade of outrageous destruction of the redwood forest by resorting to ruthless practices such as clear-cutting.
What's that?
It's the fastest and cheapest way to harvest trees and involves cutting down every tree in that area until there's nothing left. After which, the entire place is sprayed with flammable chemical herbicides such as napalm and eventually set on fire. The clear patch is then prepared to be replanted. Using this practice, Charles Hurwitz planned to maximize short-term profits from the accelerated harvest and pay off the $800 million debt he had acquired during the takeover.
I don't understand. After burning the land, they'll just replant it anyway, so what's the problem?
The problem, Grill, is that old-growth redwoods are extremely slow-growing. Once they're cut, it can take them several centuries to grow back, and even then, it still won't be the same. Once an old-growth redwood forest is gone, its original form is gone forever.
Typical human short-sightedness. Your greed will be your downfall.
The Houston businessman Charles Hurwitz had been notorious for his failure with the United Savings Association of Taxes, largely caused by his fraudulent decisions to gamble with depositors' money. It was the biggest savings and loans association in the state, the failing of which cost taxpayers about $1.6 billion and landed Charles in crippling personal debt. So, to get out of the mess he had created, he decided to become one of the cruelest enemies to the environment, especially the redwoods and the many endangered species living in the ancient forest. The redwood forest of Northern California holds some of the world's largest and oldest trees, some as old as 2,000 years old and as tall as 400 feet, which is almost the same size as a 40-story building. By clear-cutting, Charles wasn't just felling trees, he was destroying one of the world's largest and rarest ecosystems, which had remained unchanged for almost a millennia. These woods were home to a wide variety of plant and animal species, like black bears and endangered northern spotted owls, many of which depend on the specific old-growth environment. Moreover, with one of the highest carbon absorption rates, these forests are a powerful weapon against climate change. So, by clear-cutting these forests, not only is the stored carbon released back into the atmosphere, but a major carbon sink is also destroyed, worsening global climate issues. And shockingly, by the 1990s, the Pacific Lumber Company had heartlessly wiped out almost 95% of the forest. This clear-cutting practice not only led to soil erosion on a large scale since there were no trees or their roots to hold the soil in place, but the washed-out soil would then gather in rivers and lakes, harming the aquatic ecosystems. Redwoods are sought after due to their hardiness and resistance to fire and decay, but once it's cut, it becomes brittle and will often shatter during the felling process, resulting in only half of the actual tree reaching the mill for further processing.
Half of it just goes to waste?
Yep, but as a consequence of their ruthless actions, on New Year's Eve of 1996, tragedy struck. Palco had been clear-cutting trees on the windswept ridge overlooking the slightly elevated community of Stafford. It was clear that the company did not calculate the risks before felling off trees on steep slopes because it resulted in one of the biggest landslides in that area. Most of the Stafford community was buried in up to 17 feet of contaminated mud and debris. Thankfully, there were no casualties because people managed to flee in the nick of time, but 8 homes were completely destroyed. Now imagine if the members of those destroyed homes hadn't had the chance to escape. Happy families celebrating the holidays, and suddenly, thousands of pounds of earth falls on them, burying them alive. With Palco felling redwoods left and right, this scenario was a constant threat to the Stafford community. There might not have been any fatalities this time, but who knew what would happen in the future, with even fewer trees to hold the land in place? There was a desperate need for a solution or resistance that could save the remaining woods from corporate greed.
And what were they gonna do to stop them? Palco must have had some pretty deep pockets at this point if they've been continuing this cat's trophy for over a decade.
Cat's trophy? Catastrophe. Right. But the environmentalists were not giving up either. That's why they took on the strategy of tree sits and used it to not only prevent the loggers from felling more trees, but also bring more awareness to the cause. As Julia's fame grew the longer she stayed in the tree, Palco's patience wore thin. They began adopting several aggressive, life-threatening intimidation tactics to scare off Julia and other tree sitters once and for all.
Weren't they still in the limelight? What's the worst they could have done?
Well, you see, the situation became more dangerous because, at that point, it didn't seem like Palco was concerned about its image anymore. There were already some disturbing cases circulating around their name, which at first were brushed under the rug at the time. But it became pretty clear to anyone paying attention who was trying to get activists killed. For example, on May 24th, 1990, Judy Berry and Daryl Cherney, both active members of the environmental organization Earth First, were on their way from a concert and a speaking tour in Oakland, California. At the concert, their objective was to spread awareness among college students and recruit volunteers for the Redwood Summer Protest. But they never made it back, as their car blew up from a pipe bomb that was strategically placed under the driver's seat. Daryl barely got out with minimal injuries, but Judy had been the one driving at the time and received crippling injuries. Her life would now be completely changed and filled with constant pain. Judy was a threat to the Palco Logging Company, as she had succeeded in gathering significant public support to protect the ancient redwood forest. So, Palco began sending her multiple death threats and had even gone as far as accidentally ramming her car with a logging truck. As redwood summer approached, I began to receive a series of increasingly frightening written death threats, obviously written in the interest of big timber, wrote Earth First activist Judy Barry in 1992. The car bombing quickly made national headlines, and Oakland police, along with FBI bomb experts, were quick to place the blame on the victim for carrying a bomb in their car. But the general supporters were not buying it, as it was clear the bomb was literally nailed under the driver's seat.
I mean, it's common sense. Why would Judy want to blow herself up if she was succeeding at her cause?
Exactly. However, the FBI kept prolonging the case, and no justice was served. In response, both Judy and Daryl were forced to file a civil rights lawsuit against Oakland police and the FBI in order to clear their names. It wasn't until 12 years later, in 2002, that the jury declared that the police department and FBI had actually blatantly lied about the bombing. Unfortunately, Judy didn't live long enough to see that she had won a $2 million lawsuit against the FBI.
Wait, why? Did they try to kill her again?
Despite everything, Judy had continued her activism efforts for the redwood forest until she died of breast cancer at the age of 47 in 1997. You might think what happened with Judy was the extent of cruelty Palco was capable of, but that's not the case at all. When the loggers were cutting down old-growth redwoods, the protesters would often stand around trees that were about to be cut, risking their lives trying to stop the lumberjacks from destroying the forest forever. But one such incident took a deadly turn on September 17, 1998, when an Earth First environmental activist named David Nathan Chain was trying to stop loggers from felling a giant redwood tree. The massive tree crushed him upon falling. 24-year-old David died on the spot due to severe head trauma. But when this incident was brought to light by the activists, the Pacific Lumber Company spokesperson played dumb. They claimed that the loggers didn't see anyone when felling the tree. However, Earth First did not sit quiet and provided a videotape showing Arlington Earl Amons, the 52-year-old logger responsible for the tree's fall, shouting at the victim activist. They also added that the company had been deliberately cutting down large trees in a downhill manner, so they fell with greater speed in the direction of the protesters, giving them no time to escape. Despite the clear evidence showing the murder of young David, the case did not reach a proper conclusion. It simply settled on a wrongful death settlement between David's mother and the logging company. Thus, when Palco resorted to various intimidation tactics toward Julia Butterfly Hill, the situation was grave, as there was no telling what they would be willing to do to her. It began with loggers at the bottom of the tree yelling obscene insults and vulgar threats of what they would do to her once they got her down, all the while cutting down the trees growing out of the base of Luna and telling her that, "We're cutting the trunk of Luna now, you better come down." When verbally harassing Julia didn't seem to work, Palco resorted to potentially deadly threats of violence. They would fire gunshots that felt like they were aimed very close to her. At one point, they even brought in twin-propeller helicopters to produce a massive gust of wind towards her little nest, causing most amenities to fall off and forcing her to hold onto the tree for dear life, waiting for the torture to be over. At night, they would make loud noises and shine giant floodlights facing the treetop to prevent Julia from sleeping.
They were trying to wear me down, and they were doing a really good job of it.
When taking away her rest didn't work either, Charles Hurwitz's loggers decided to stand guard around the tree, threatening any volunteer who dared to come near Luna and supply Julia with food and other essentials. She had to scrape by with the little food she had left. She did not know when she could get supplies again, if at all. Moreover, her cell phone was nearing the last of its battery. They gave her a choice: either come down from the tree or starve to death. But none of their tactics seemed to faze Julia. Using her pager, she came up with a radical idea to not only get supplies, but possibly put an end to this unlawful siege. A group of 19 activists volunteered for the grand plan. They waited until there were only 3 guards on duty, and just when they had their guards down, the activists sprang into action. 19 people were running around in all directions, creating an irrepressible divergence. And it's not like the 3 Palco guards could do anything. One of them had coincidentally developed a crush on Julia, so he was no trouble at all. As for the other 2, one was looking after their supplies, and the other had no choice but to panic, looking at 19 people running and yelling around them. The activists did not just get a supply bag up to Julia once, but twice, and even warned the guard as they were leaving, "See you next week." The next day, all guards were pulled back. They had realized that their efforts to guard the tree were futile, and eventually called off the supply siege. Julia would take classes and study on her laptop at night, and for most of her day, she would give interviews to the press and spend time reflecting with Luna. She also learned and adopted different survival skills. For example, if she didn't wash the sap off the soles of her feet, it would help her stick to the tree better. Julia describes the bittersweet view of watching the beautiful forest, snow-capped mountains in the distance, and then suddenly, the picturesque scenery would be filled with the ear-bleeding noise of chainsaws cutting through the trees. And unfortunately, hostile lumberjacks weren't the only danger Julia faced. Just 2 days after the supply siege by Charles's guards was called off, a massive storm hit the forest. Strong gusts of wind roaring at 70 kilometers per hour tilted Julia's platform nest to the side and made raindrops feel like needles against her skin. As she desperately tried to hang on, she thought it was the end. Images of the platform falling from 180 feet and taking her with it kept flashing in her mind. With one particularly strong gust of wind, she was thrown a number of feet into the air and out of the nest. But luckily, one of Luna's branches caught her. Hail flew everywhere as she clung onto the branch for dear life. Julia clenched her eyes and teeth shut, waiting for the nightmare to be over. As time passed, she began having an out-of-body experience. Disconnected from everything, she began questioning all of her attachments in life so far.
When I climbed into the tree, I was still very attached to comfortability. I was attached to fear. I was attached to anger and frustration and sadness. I reached a point where it was learn and transform or die.
She would fall sick from the cold, freezing rain and unpredictable weather. The world record had been broken a long time ago, but Julia's commitment never wavered. She refused to get down the tree until a meaningful resolution was taken. The tree sit became more to her than just saving the redwood forest. She felt it gave her the healing she had been looking for since her tragic accident. Julia's resilience did not go unnoticed, and she even inspired others to take on the task of sitting in trees and actually staying in them for months on end. Nate Madsen, a State University student, was managing multiple side jobs and his studies to make ends meet. Amidst his stressful life, he had one safe haven, the 80-acre grove of giant redwoods in Freshwater Creek Forest. But Nate soon realized that the place where he felt most at peace would soon disappear when he started seeing trees marked with the dreaded giant orange X. One evening, while Julia was midway through her own tree sit, Nate's friend Roger gave him the tragic news. "Hey, Nate, I don't want to bum you out, but they're going to cut that grove today." That day, Nate waited impatiently until his work shift was over to go to the grove, hoping it would be safer with the loggers gone after their day's work. On his way, he kept praying that they hadn't wiped out the entire area, but when he reached the grove, he was horrified to see that only one tree was left standing. He didn't have to think twice before climbing up the giant 200-foot redwood using the smaller trees sprouting from its main trunk. He named the redwood Mariah, inspired by the song They Call the Wind Mariah from the musical Paint Your Wagon. Mariah was 12 feet in diameter, and its lowest branch was at least 80 feet high. It wasn't until he reached about 130 feet above the ground that he found a spot to form a small nest. With the help of tree twine, he hauled up the supplies brought by his friend Roger. They were basic essentials like food, a 50-foot rope, a sleeping bag, and a tarp. The real challenge began when loggers came to take down the last tree standing in the morning, only to find an activist nesting up the tree. Just as they intimidated Julia, they began threatening Nate as well. However, this time, they decided to scare him by cutting the small growths at the bottom of Mariah. The chainsaw cutting through redwood made the whole tree vibrate, leaving Nate in a panicked state, thinking perhaps the loggers were actually going to cut the tree with him still in it. Nate couldn't stay as long as Julia, but he managed to continue for the next 6 months, the second longest period in history. He even had to complete his degree on a laptop while in the tree, but he has no regrets about his efforts in protecting Mariah. According to Nate, "I've never felt more alive than I did during my time looking after Mariah." On the other hand, Julia prolonged her stay to almost 738 days in her mission to protect Luna. And finally, after 2 years, a resolution was made that shocked the world. In 1999, Julia finally agreed to climb down Luna when Pacific Lumber Company agreed to preserve all the trees within a 200-foot buffer zone around Luna. But it didn't end there. They also demanded that funds of $50,000 that Julia and other activists raised during her stay in the tree would be given to Palco.
Wait, what? Didn't these guys harass the protesters and cut down all those trees? Why were they getting money out of all this?
You do have a point, Grill, but the 50 grand was actually used as leverage to reach a compromise and ensure that Luna and the buffer zone around it remained safe. Also, the company didn't really get to keep the money. They eventually had to donate it all to Cal Poly Humboldt for research on sustainable forestry practices.
Well, I guess that's okay-ish. But didn't you say the forest was thousands of acres big? And if she only managed to save 200-foot buffer zone, what happened to the rest?
They burned it.
They what?
No, I'm kidding. Could you imagine? But it's good to see you being concerned for the trees, Grill. With the cumulative effort and many sacrifices of Julia and thousands of other activists, especially Judy Berry, the movement became bigger in just a few years. The protesters involved in the Redwood Summer Movement in Mendocino County played a critical role in spreading awareness regarding the gravity of the situation. The whole idea was to bring attention to this critical issue, that we were down to 5% of our original redwoods, said Pam Davis, one of the activists. It was around this time that tensions grew, leading to violent reactions such as the bombing incident of Judy Berry taking place. The silver lining, however, was that they resulted in a turning point for the entire movement. It changed everything, adds activist Karen Pickett. And as horrible as it sounds, other activists agree with it. It was a very long and difficult road, and I think it would have been very different had Judy not been bombed so early in our campaign. Finally, in 1998, the Headwaters Forest Reserve was established to protect about 7,472 acres of old-growth redwood forest in California's Humboldt County. This happened after Charles Hurwitz signed a bittersweet agreement to give up on the land in exchange for $380 million.
Why bittersweet?
Because it was only 13% of the total area the activists had been trying to protect.
And that scumbag still got $380 million? God, this story is infuriating.
And I'm sorry, Grill, but it gets worse. Despite the establishment of the reserve, the lumberjacks of the logging company continued cutting down trees illegally.
What the f***?
And as if the loggers weren't enough, vandals joined the war too. In November 2000, forest vandals cut a 32-inch deep gash into Luna around the base, which was almost half its circumference. This immediately caught the attention of the Bureau of Land Management, which took measures to protect Luna by installing a bracing system designed by Eureka civil engineer Steve Salzman. The bracing system helped keep the tree bullies away and strengthened the old tree enough to withstand windstorms. These illegal battles continued for about 8 more years until 2007, when Pacific Lumber Company finally filed for bankruptcy, ending the decades-long environmental war.
Yeah, good riddance.
After the damage, the BLM advised multiple strategies to restore the remaining 52,000 acres of forest that the activists had originally been trying to save with their blood, sweat, and tears. Over the years, tensions between loggers and activists eased as the habitat began to restore, and the destroyed areas were gradually replanted. Efforts have also been made to reverse the soil erosion caused, which has kept sediment out of streams and also protected the salmon spawning habitats. BLM developed a really cutting-edge restoration plan on that land and deserves a lot of credit for that, says Pickett, an environmentalist. It won't be wrong to say that even though Julia directly only saved the 200-foot zone around Luna, her impeccable resilience and bold stunt of living in a tree for 2 years worked as a catalyst for a far-reaching and far-lasting result. She finally achieved what she had promised herself, but remained humble despite people turning her into an environmental superhero. When they turn me into a celebrity or a personality, they make it seem like I'm some unattainable goal. And I'm not. I'm not a superhero, said Julia in an interview after coming down from Luna. She went on to become a motivational speaker and the co-founder of Circle of Life Foundation, a small group of civil leaders working to bring about social change. She even wrote a book about her tree-sitting experience, The Legacy of Luna, the story of a tree, a woman, and the struggle to save the redwoods in 2000. Since then, she has been featured in many documentaries about her incredible journey.
Man, she really took a stand by sitting.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, if you need me, I'm gonna go look for some tools to fix that chair of yours. No sense in letting that tree get cut down for nothing.
Wonderful idea. Let me know if you need any help. We hope you found this video informative, and if you did, please consider subscribing to our channel, as it's the best thing you can do to help us keep making more videos, like this one, about the boy who vanished and the stranger that took his place.